Breaking news, we are just getting more in about the airstrike that killed 35 people at a base on Poland's border with Ukraine. Fox News reporting that the missiles were fired at long range from Russian airspace, and they hit their target, the Yavoriv military base, just 15 miles. Look at this map. East of the Polish border, raising NATO's already clanging alarm bells. Could Russia's most western attack only be the start of Vladimir Putin's encroachment further into Europe? Press Secretary John Kirby of the Pentagon is about to hold a briefing there. We are keeping an eye on that podium. The minute he starts talking, we're expected to get some headlines. We'll get you any important details. But for now, I want to bring in Defense Priorities senior fellow and military expert, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who gave 21 years of service to the U.S. Army, including 4 deployments in Operation Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Colonel, 35 people killed in that strike, 134 injured. We now have an American journalist shot and killed by Russian forces near Kiev. Is Vladimir Putin turning this into a game of inches to draw NATO into the war? What does this look like to you?
I don't think that he wants to draw NATO in, but he is very, very risky in what he's doing, because he's trying to send a signal that, hey, I'm not just going to sit passively by while you keep sending all this lethal aid into the Ukrainians that are then used on my troops. And so he is taking this huge risk that nothing went astray, no missile didn't miss its target and go across the border. And then they afterwards doubled down on that and said, we're going to continue to hit other targets, maybe even further to the west. So it's something that we have to be, watch very, very carefully. And the biggest concern I have is that anything happens that goes beyond the borders and it potentially strikes an Article 5 guarantee, and suddenly it's a NATO war instead of just contained in Ukraine. And we have to avoid that at all costs.
When you say if anything happens, a piece of shrapnel somehow hitting something on the Polish border, what would draw NATO into triggering Article 5, which, of course, is an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us, and then the pile-on begins?
Well, you've heard President Biden in just recent days reaffirming, and emphatically so, that any attack on 1 inch of NATO territory will be seen as an attack on all, and appropriate responses. Now, I hope that that's just bluster, that, as you described there, if there was an inadvertent something that just went across the border and just hit on some territory but didn't kill anyone. We have to be very, very careful on this and very distinguishing. We can't just automatically go, okay, that's it with war. That would be bad for us, because we cannot get into a situation where a tactical nuclear weapon is in the potential for use. And that's why it's so critical. We have to be just very careful.
Vladimir Putin has tried now gaslighting, false flagging, whatever you want to call it, saying that, oh, the United States is helping Ukraine develop chemical weapons or biological weapons. Obviously not true. However, is that sort of the premise for his effort to start using a chemical weapon? And if so, does that constitute, even if it hits on Ukrainian territory, but as we know, these weapons go where the wind goes, and if the wind patterns were to flow across the rest of Europe, does that constitute an attack on one?
Well, it certainly could, and that's a big danger. I rather think, though, that probably the greater likelihood is that message is intended for the Russian domestic audience, to show that, oh, my gosh, look how bad the other side is. That's why this war is just and right, and you need to support us, as opposed to laying the pretext, which they have done in other occasions. But this would be bad because, as you said, if the wind changes directions, it's going to hit the Russian troops, and they know that it's going to get global condemnation. So I hope I'm right, but I think that it's just for domestic purposes.
Russia's reportedly asked China, according to the New York Times, for military aid. There wasn't much detail there, but we know they've already lobbed something like 700 missiles. They got to be running low. They both deny it. China and Russia say, call never happened. We're not interested. But good Lord, how do we sanction China if it does appear that they're somehow assisting Russia?
Well, that's the big challenge, because, I mean, my earlier concern was that China would move on Taiwan at the same time Russia moved on Ukraine. And thank God that didn't happen, because that would put us in just a horrible situation. The world can band together and sanction Russia, just like the craziness that it's done, to the extraordinary levels. But we can't afford to sanction both countries at the same time, because our economies are inextricably tied to that, and it would harm us even more if we had to do that. So I sure hope it doesn't come to that, but it can't be any surprise. I mean, the closeness with which Russia and China have been developing over the last few years, and especially over the last 6 months prior to this is no surprise.
No, and the misery that we're seeing on the screen, not to mention that Russia is killing pregnant women. We saw that attack and the baby died, the pregnant woman died. It is absolutely horrifying. But as we finish up here, Russia is closing in on Kiev. We have heard that now for more than a week and a half. That convoy is supposedly just 9 miles from the capital city. Can you just give us some clarity on how we're supposed to view that?
Yeah, what Russia's doing, it's pretty clear. It's kind of coming into sharp focus now, what they're doing. They are setting the conditions for an assault on Kiev. But so they have almost 3 sides of Kiev circled off there from the north and from the west. And now that they're putting most of their combat effectiveness to the northeast around the Sumy area, and they want to try to close off some Ukrainian military forces. If they do, they can turn the rest of their forces and potentially come and completely surround Kiev. And that's when the real danger for this population begins.
Colonel Davis, thank you so much for opening your brain and your military mind. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.